week 5 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few wide receivers I would bench this week. The first guy, Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So Brandon Aiyuk, I mentioned him as a bench last week in a tougher matchup versus the Rams, and he only had 4 catches for 37 yards. So Aiyuk this season, it's been tough to deal with him so far. Week 2, decent ball game, 11 fantasy points. And week 3, a touchdown saved him at Denver. So right now, Jimmy Garoppolo, he's pretty much just zeroing in on Deebo Samuel. And I think George Kittle soon is going to be more than just a blocker as he's trying to get healthy after returning a few weeks ago. So right here, week 5 at Carolina, they give up the 16th most fantasy points to wide receivers. But I could see this ball game being a Deebo type of game and a Jeff Wilson Jr. type of game, and a defense making a few plays where Jimmy Garoppolo don't have to throw the football enough. So after the last couple weeks here, up and down for Brandon Aiyuk, there's no way I'm going to trust him, even as a flex option. If I got better options, and I would bench him this week. The next guy's Elijah Moore of the New York Jets. So right now, it looks like Moore is the number 3 receiver over there in New York. A lot of people thought, because it was Joe Flacco in, he's not getting targets and not making plays. But Corey Davis and Garrett Wilson were still making plays with Flacco in. And then last week at Pittsburgh in a plus matchup with Zach Wilson finally back in the lineup. 2 rush yards, 3 catches, 53 yards on only 4 targets. So this week here, great matchup again on paper, but it don't mean much versus the Dolphins, who give up the 8th most fantasy points to wide receivers. So right now, Garrett Wilson and obviously Corey Davis are the top 2 targets over there at wide receiver. But this ain't a great matchup. The only guy I really would trust to start this week, unless you're desperate, would be Corey Davis to start. But Garrett Wilson's the only guy I would look to start, and I got him number 33 is Wilson in my receiving rankings. But Elijah Moore, he hasn't done anything this season. He's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points. And this week here, already in week 5, especially if you're down there in the standings, there's no way you could trust him and start him this week. The next guy is Allen Robinson of the Los Angeles Rams. So Robinson, I thought he'd be better than he was last season, but it's pretty much more of the same for him, which is very hard to believe, especially playing with a guy like Cooper Kupp, who opens the whole field up, and play with a quarterback with Matthew Stafford, who stretches the field. But Allen Robinson, he's been just as bad as he was last season, except week 2 was his best game of the year. 4 catches, 53 yards, 2 touchdowns. Then week 3 at Arizona, 2 catches, 23 yards on 5 targets. And week 4 at San Francisco, 6 targets, 2 catches, 7 yards. So he's been non-existent. And this is a pretty tough matchup here in this one versus the Dallas Cowboys that give up the 6th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So there's no way you could have confidence starting Allen Robinson. Would it surprise me that he has a decent ball game? No, but there's just no way you go with him. And this week, he's an easy wide receiver to bench, and also a guy that's almost approachable to drop as well if he does nothing this week. The next guy's Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills. So Gabe Davis, I was big on him coming into the season, and week 1, he looked like he was going to be a big-time player for this Buffalo Bill team with 4 catches, 88 yards, and a touchdown. And then week 2, when he missed the game with the ankle injury. Week 3 in Miami, only 3 catches, 37 yards. And week 4, I said to bench him, even though it was an amazing matchup at Baltimore that gives up the most fantasy points to receivers, and he only had 1 lousy catch for 13 yards. So week 5 here, another plus matchup on paper versus Pittsburgh that gives up the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. But right here, I had Gabe Davis just at number 36, making the end of the list here. But if you want to bench him, that's clearly fine. He hasn't done nothing the last few weeks. I know Isaiah McKenzie, he might be out in this ball game in concussion protocol. But how could you really trust Gabe Davis? The only plus I give to him, he's been on the field pretty much every play. 112 routes he's ran in the last 2 ball games, but only 9 targets, and that's not a good number at all. But right now, maybe he's not 100%. Maybe he'll get going this week, you would hope, but I just can't trust him, especially if you're down there in the standings and you know you need more of a guarantee from someone. This week I will bench him. And the 5th and final wide receiver I will bench this week here is George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Pickens, no doubt about it, top pickup this week he was. But to throw him in the fire now with Buffalo, it's going to be tough. They give up the 4th least amount of fantasy points to wide receivers. I know him and Kenny Pickett had a good rapport, obviously working with the second team in practice, and in a good ball game where Pickett went for 6 catches, 102 yards. A lot of hype on him coming in, obviously, to the season, and rightfully so. This guy's a highlight reel. He could run the routes, and he could catch almost any ball if you put it in the area. But this week at Buffalo, it's tough to throw him in the lineup. And I still think this Steelers team is going to run Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool ahead of him. So Pickens, I would take a wait-and-see approach this week here with the tough matchup. And if he does it again on your bench, not the end of the world. Then you pretty much got a number 2 or flex option weekly on your roster. But I just don't like the matchup this week, and I would just take a wait-and-see approach with Pickens. But if he passes the test and has a monster game with Buffalo, then you got a receiver you could start every week. Your wide receivers I look to bench here for week 5 of the fantasy football season.